The ceiling of the medical bay was an unsettling shade of teal, and the lights buzzed like a swarm of angry insects. Thomas Newell blinked up at it, trying to steady his breathing. His left arm was twisted at a grotesque angle, pain radiating from his shoulder down to his fingertips. "Patient is experiencing terminal destabilization," the doctor shrieked. The voice was high-pitched, bordering on frantic, and came from a creature with translucent skin and a dozen waving tendrils where a mouth should have been. Thomas groaned, trying to lift his good arm. No, it's just a dislocated shoulder," he mumbled. The alien doctor, who had introduced himself earlier as Sylph, whirled around, tentacles flaring out dramatically. "The vital readings are catastrophic. Internal systems are collapsing." Another alien, shorter and covered in slate-gray scales, rushed in with a tray of glimmering tools. "Shall I initiate the terminal response protocol, Dr. Sylph?" Thomas tried to sit up but immediately regretted it as a stabbing pain shot through his chest. "No terminal anything. Jesus, listen, it's just out of the socket. Pop it back in and I'll be fine." Sylph loomed over him, scanning frantically with a device that beeped with rising urgency. "The patient's cardiac rhythm is erratic. Oxygen saturation is declining. Skeletal configuration is compromised." Thomas gritted his teeth, trying to stay calm. He'd fallen during a maintenance check outside the human sector of the station, slipped on some slime from who knows what species, and landed badly. It hurt like hell, but he wasn't dying. "I need you to listen to me," Thomas said through clenched teeth. "I'm not dying. You're reading shock and pain responses. Dislocated shoulder. Happens to people. You gotta put it back." Sylph and the gray-scaled assistant exchanged horrified glances. "You request reconfiguration without terminal stabilization measures?" "Yes," Thomas barked, then immediately flinched at the movement. The assistant, whose badge read Clin, edged closer, holding a shimmering rod. "This tool severs nerve clusters to prevent suffering before bodily cessation." Thomas's eyes widened. "No nerve severing. Look, just hold my arm and pull." Sylph cut him off, initiating full body stasis to mitigate terminal cascade. "No!" Thomas shouted, trying to roll off the table but only managing to flop painfully onto his side. "Stop. Just listen." Sylph paused, tentacles quivering. Clin hesitated, the shimmering rod inches from Thomas's shoulder. "Okay," Thomas panted. "I'll explain. You know how your species can regenerate torn tendrils? Humans can't do that. But bones and joints, we can fix some of that ourselves if you help. Dislocation means the bone popped out. You pop it back in. Painful, yes. Deadly, no." Sylph looked unconvinced. "Probability of survival?" 99.9%, Thomas said, though he was really just guessing. "Please." Clin slowly lowered the rod. "Manual reconfiguration. It's barbaric." "Maybe," Thomas said. "But it works." Sylph hesitated another second, then gestured to Clin. "Prepare for primitive reconfiguration." Clin reluctantly set aside the rod and brought over a scanning device the size of a watermelon. It hovered over Thomas, humming softly. "Bone structure detachment confirmed," Clin announced. "Subclavian and humeral articulations compromised." "Yeah," Thomas muttered. "That's what I said." Sylph clicked two tendrils together, some kind of alien sigh, and moved to Thomas's injured side. "This will be unpleasant," Sylph warned. Thomas gave a strained laugh. "Already is." Without further ceremony, Sylph grabbed Thomas's arm. Clin braced his torso. Thomas clenched his jaw as Sylph pulled, twisted, and shoved the arm. Pain erupted like fireworks in his skull. He shouted, a raw, involuntary sound. But then there was a sickening clunk, and the agony receded to a deep, throbbing ache. "There," Thomas gasped. Sylph released him, stepping back as if expecting him to burst into flames. Thomas flexed his fingers experimentally. His arm moved, stiff and sore but back in place. "You survived the reconfiguration," Sylph said, wide-eyed. "Yeah," Thomas said, letting his head thud back against the table. "Told you." For a few moments, The room was silent except for the soft humming of the medical scanners recalibrating. Further stabilization required, Clint said. Binding and immobilization. Yeah, Thomas agreed. Sling would be good. Sylph and Clint moved with exaggerated care, wrapping his arm against his chest with a flexible bandage that hardened slightly once applied. Thomas let them work, too tired to argue. Afterward, Sylph pulled up a glowing screen, scanning the data. Organ functions returning to baseline parameters, Sylph said. Oxygen saturation normalizing. Cardiac rhythm stabilizing. No kidding, Thomas said, closing his eyes briefly. Told you. Not dying. Sylph looked at him with a strange mix of awe and horror. Your species endures catastrophic joint separation with minimal intervention. Yeah, Thomas murmured. We're weird like that. Clint hesitated, then spoke. There is a mandatory observation period of 20 standard hours. Thomas opened one eye. Fine, but no more nerve-severing rods. Clint looked almost embarrassed. Affirmative. The medbay lights dimmed slightly, signaling a shift into low-activity mode. Thomas drifted into a restless sleep, the ache in his shoulder a constant, nagging companion. When Thomas woke, a different alien was standing at the foot of his bed. She was taller than Sylph or Clint, with glistening green skin and a stern expression. I am Dr. Velra, she announced. I have reviewed your case. Thomas struggled to sit up. Great. Do I get out of here soon? Velra made a low, vibrating sound. Your resilience is unusual. However, your skeletal repair requires a mobilization for at least 3 of your Earth weeks. Thomas groaned. 3 weeks? Seriously. Prolonged instability risks permanent dysfunction, Velra said. Compliance is mandatory. Thomas sagged back against the bed. Fine. Velra approached, tapping on a small console. A mechanical sling extended from the bed, cradling his arm. You will remain under observation for 2 more station cycles, she said. Then you may relocate to your assigned quarters with restrictions. Awesome, Thomas muttered. Velra tilted her head. Your sarcasm is noted. Thomas closed his eyes again, wishing for real painkillers instead of the mild, numbing gels the aliens used. Maybe when he got back to the human zone, he could argue for some actual meds. By the end of the 2nd cycle, Thomas was allowed to shuffle out of the medbay, escorted by Clint, who insisted on carrying his minimal belongings in a floating orb. Any strenuous activity is forbidden, Clint said firmly. I got it, Thomas said. No heavy lifting, no running, no fighting space monsters. Clint blinked. There are no space monsters within this facility. Just a joke, Thomas said. Clint looked confused. Jokes are illogical. Thomas sighed. Yeah, tell me about it. They reached the human sector, a series of modular rooms cobbled together with a mix of Earth and alien tech. It smelled faintly of coffee and machine oil, homie, in a weird way. As Clint hovered awkwardly at the entrance, Thomas turned to him. Thanks for not. Severing my nerves. Clint gave a small bow. Your species is perplexing. Your injuries should have been fatal. Yeah, Thomas said, stepping inside. We get that a lot. The door slid shut behind him, and for the first time in days, Thomas allowed himself a small smile. His shoulder throbbed, his body ached, and he was stuck doing one-handed chores for weeks, but he was alive. And somewhere out there, an entire medical team of aliens was probably documenting him as a medical anomaly. Thomas woke to the clatter of something metallic hitting the floor. He cracked open one eye and saw Clint frantically gathering up a pile of shining discs that had spilled across the entryway to his quarters. The floating orb that had been carrying them bobbed unhelpfully in the air, clearly overloaded. You're back, Thomas rasped, voice hoarse from sleep. You have missed your scheduled nutrient intake, Clint said, stacking the discs with great care. And your hydration levels are suboptimal. Thomas swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as his shoulder protested. You don't have to babysit me, you know? Clint paused, blinking his wide, pupil-less eyes. Non-compliance with recovery protocols may result in permanent limb degradation. I have volunteered for supervisory duty. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. Lucky me. Clint finished tacking the discs, then gestured awkwardly. These are for your rehabilitation. Thomas eyed the discs skeptically. Each one was about the size of a dinner plate, etched with faint patterns that shimmered when they caught the light. Gonna have to explain that one, Thomas said, pushing himself upright carefully. Clint lifted one of the discs, holding it with 2 careful claws. They emit low-frequency kinetic fields to stimulate musculoskeletal recovery. You will balance them. Balance them, Thomas repeated. With one arm. Correct. Thomas sighed. You know we usually start with, like, rubber bands and light stretches? Clint considered this. Primitive but adaptable. You may attempt your method if you prefer. Thomas shook his head. No, let's see what your fancy alien tech can do. Clint placed one of the discs on a slim pedestal. It floated a few inches above the surface, wobbling slightly. You must maintain stability using only minor adjustments of your upper limb, Clint instructed. Got it, Thomas said, stepping closer. He reached out with his good arm, but Clint clicked a warning sound. Utilize the injured appendage. Thomas stared at him. You want me to balance a floating plate with the arm that just got jammed back into my body? Affirmative. Controlled exertion will encourage proper healing. Thomas muttered something under his breath but complied. He slipped his injured arm free of the sling and immediately regretted it as a sharp ache flared through his shoulder. Gritting his teeth, he extended his hand toward the disc. It hovered with maddening instability, shivering at the slightest movement. Thomas adjusted his wrist minutely, trying to keep it level. His muscles screamed in protest. Maintain alignment within 3 degrees of deviation, Clint said. Thomas grimaced. How about I maintain it within, not falling over, degrees? Clint made a note on a small handheld console. Suboptimal compliance noted. Thomas focused, drawing shallow breaths. Sweat prickled at his brow. The disc trembled but stayed aloft. After what felt like an hour, Clint tapped the console again. Satisfactory for initial trial. Thomas let his arm drop with a groan. You guys have no concept of taking it easy, do you? Clint looked genuinely puzzled. Why would we? Thomas sat heavily on the nearest chair, cradling his arm. Because sometimes healing isn't about pushing harder. It's about letting things settle. Clint tilted his head. Your species' reliance on passive recovery is inefficient. Thomas shrugged, immediately regretting it. Maybe, but it's what we've got. Clint stored the discs back in the orb, which obediently zipped them away. There is another matter requiring your attention, Clint said. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. Of course there is. Clint produced a slim tablet and handed it to him. You have been summoned for a formal evaluation by the Interspecies Health Commission. Thomas blinked at the screen. What, like a checkup? Clint hesitated. More an inquiry. Thomas squinted at the notice. The words anomalous biological event review were prominently displayed. You make it sound like I exploded or something, Thomas muttered. Your survival has raised significant concerns regarding station health protocols, Clint said. Thomas rubbed his face with his good hand. Great. I'm a walking biohazard now. Not hazardous, Clint corrected. Merely statistically improbable. Thomas dropped the tablet onto the table. When? 1 station cycle from now, Clint said. Preparation is advisable. Thomas leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Any advice? Clint considered. Avoid exhibiting further improbable behaviors. Thomas laughed, a short, bitter sound. I'll try not to dislocate anything else. 16 hours later, Thomas found himself standing in a cavernous chamber that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic. A semicircle of aliens of various sizes and shapes sat behind a glowing barrier, studying him with identical expressions of wary fascination. Velra was there, seated at the center. She wore a ceremonial sash that shimmered with embedded micro-lights. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his arms still strapped tightly against his chest. Representative Newell, Velra began. You are here to provide clarification regarding your recent medical event. Thomas nodded, trying to keep a straight face. A being to Velra's left, its body resembling a bundle of iridescent cables, spoke next. Our preliminary analysis indicates your physical systems should have failed under the trauma sustained. Thomas scratched the back of his neck. Yeah, well, human bodies are stubborn. Several of the council members exchanged glances, a ripple of colors flashing across their skin or appendages. Velra leaned forward. Please describe the specific mechanisms by which your body compensated for the injury. Thomas exhaled slowly. All right. So, when a human joint pops out, it hurts like hell, but unless there's major nerve or blood vessel damage, it doesn't kill us. Our muscles lock up to protect the area. Blood flow increases to start repairs. Pain signals tell us to stop making it worse. The cable being shivered, a clear sign of agitation. You possess no internal regenerative matrix. Thomas shook his head. Nope. Just inflammation, scar tissue, and stubbornness. A being shaped like a giant, translucent mollusk gurgled in what Thomas guessed was amazement. Velra tapped a panel in front of her. Your stubbornness, as you call it, allowed for survival without comprehensive intervention. Thomas grinned weakly. Guess so. The mollusk being slid forward slightly. Would you consent to genetic analysis? Thomas's smile faded. Depends. What do you plan to do with it? Velra replied immediately. Scientific study only. No replication, alteration, or weaponization. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You had to specify no weaponization? Velra's gaze did not waver. It has been proposed. Thomas groaned inwardly. Look, I'll think about it. But no cloning me into an army of stubborn idiots, all right? A low ripple of sound passed among the aliens, their version of laughter, Thomas hoped. Velra nodded. Your response is acceptable. Further, you are to undergo a supervised rehabilitation program tailored to your anomalous physiology. Thomas grimaced. More floating plates? Clint, who had been standing silently at the edge of the room, stepped forward. Advanced protocols have been designed. Thomas gave him a wary look. Define advanced. Clint hesitated. You will perform dynamic stability exercises in variable gravity fields. Thomas stared. Wait, variable gravity? Correct, Clint said. Enhance recovery through controlled instability. Thomas rubbed his temples. You guys really don't believe in taking it slow, do you? Velra spoke again. Human methodology emphasizes patience and gradual adaptation. Alien methodology emphasizes efficiency and systemic optimization. Thomas sighed. And somewhere between those two, maybe I'll actually heal. The council seemed to consider this. Velra finally said, you are dismissed. Recovery will be monitored. Thomas gave a bow that was more of an awkward nod and turned to leave. Clint fell into step beside him. You will require specialized equipment, Clint said. Of course I will, Thomas muttered. As they exited the chamber, Thomas glanced at Clint. You know, back home, we just use slings, ice packs, and a lot of bad TV shows to recover. Clint blinked. Television therapy? Thomas chuckled. Not exactly. More like mental distraction. Clint tapped his console thoughtfully. I will requisition entertainment modules suitable for human cognitive patterns. Thomas clapped him on the back with his good hand. You're all right, Clint. Weird, but all right. Clint stumbled slightly and used human gestures but recovered quickly. As they made their way back toward the human sector, Thomas couldn't help but wonder what fresh lunacy awaited him in the so-called advanced rehabilitation. Whatever it was, he had a nagging feeling that compared to getting his shoulder jammed back into place, it was going to be a whole new level of insane. Thomas sat on the edge of the new rehabilitation platform, which looked suspiciously like a children's jungle gym floating in the middle of a zero-gravity chamber. He flexed his fingers, testing the stiffness in his shoulder under the watchful eyes of Clint and two new aliens he hadn't met before. One resembled a towering pile of coral, the other a thin, insect-like being with too many elbows. This is your first session in dynamic field modulation, Clint said, adjusting a control panel. Gravity variance will not exceed 20% deviation. Thomas squinted at the platform. And if I fall? The coral-like alien emitted a series of low clicks. Impact will be minimal. Structural foam will deploy. Thomas eyed the thin, filmy layer covering the walls. Right? Foam. Great. Clint gestured toward the structure. Begin with the lowest tier. Traverse manually. Thomas sighed and pushed himself toward the floating scaffold. Immediately, he could feel the subtle changes in gravitational pull as if invisible hands were tugging at him from odd angles. His injured arm was strapped tightly against his chest still, leaving him one working arm to navigate. He grabbed the first bar and swung his legs up, grunting as he shifted his weight. The structure wobbled slightly but held. The insectoid alien's voice buzzed like a faraway engine. Observe his compensatory adaptations. Fascinating. Human musculoskeletal responses rely heavily on elastic recoil, Clint said, noting something on his handheld device. Thomas gritted his teeth and pulled himself along, careful not to jostle his healing shoulder. Each movement had to be deliberate, small corrections fighting the unpredictable tugs of gravity. How far do I have to get before you call it a day? Thomas asked, panting. Completion of 2 circuits, Clint replied. Thomas glanced at the looping structure. 2? You guys are relentless. You exhibit high strain tolerance, the coral alien said. This justifies elevated expectations. Thomas muttered under his breath but kept moving. His good arm was already trembling from the effort, but he refused to ask for a break. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the end of the first circuit and dropped carefully onto a small platform. His legs floated awkwardly upward until he kicked against a handhold to stabilize himself. 1 completed, Clint said. Your cardiac output has increased by 30%. Yeah, that's what happens when you make someone do an obstacle course in space, Thomas said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his uniform, the insectoid being tilted its head. Perhaps the human requires motivational stimuli. Thomas groaned. Please don't start piping in inspirational music or something. I'm begging you. Clint hesitated. Auditory encouragement has been documented to improve performance. Not today, Thomas said, pushing off for the second lap. Midway through, the gravity field shifted harder, pulling him sideways just as he reached for a bar. He missed and spun awkwardly in the air, cursing. The coral alien tapped a control, and a soft burst of foam erupted from the wall, catching Thomas before he could crash into anything unforgiving. Recovery protocol engaged, Clint announced. Thomas flailed until he managed to plant his feet against the foam and push off gently, spinning back toward the structure. Maybe next time, Thomas said between gasps. You warn me before the gravity tries to body slam me. Adaptation under unpredictable conditions enhances resilience, Clint said. Thomas grabbed a bar and hauled himself back onto the path, jaw set. His shoulder ached dully, but he pushed through it, moving slower but with more control now that he knew the field could shift at random. The insectoid buzzed again. His equilibrium compensation is remarkable. Human vestibular systems are robust even under duress, Clint agreed. Thomas tuned them out, focusing solely on the next bar, then the next. When he finally swung onto the final platform, he let himself drift down onto the soft foam with a heavy exhale. 2 circuits completed, Clint confirmed, sounding almost surprised. Thomas lay there, staring at the ceiling. Tell me there's a reward. Clint considered. Nutrient supplementation is scheduled. Thomas rolled his eyes. I was thinking more like a nap. Rest cycles are permitted following rehabilitation exercises, Clint said. The coral alien approached, its many tiny polyps undulating slightly. You have demonstrated sufficient recovery potential. Further sessions will escalate in complexity. Thomas sat up slowly. Fantastic. Can't wait. Clint floated closer. You will return for the next session after a minimum of 8 station hours. Thomas pushed himself to his feet. Fine. But next time, I'm bringing music whether you like it or not. The insectoid alien clicked its mandibles thoughtfully. Human auditory rituals warrant further study. Thomas limped toward the exit, favoring his sore side. Be my guest. Just don't expect it to make me float any better. Outside the chamber, the station's ambient light had dimmed slightly, signaling the approach of the rest phase. Clint walked beside him, tablet tucked under one arm. Your recovery trajectory is exceeding projections, Clint said. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. You sound almost disappointed. Unexpected variables complicate predictive modeling, Clint said. Welcome to the human experience, Thomas said with a tired grin. Back at his quarters, Clint paused at the door. Additional rehabilitation modules will be delivered after your rest cycle. Thomas nodded. Thanks, Clint. Really? Clint tilted his head. Assistance is my duty. Thomas watched him leave, then stepped inside, sagging onto his narrow bunk. His whole body ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that said he was healing. The next morning, or whatever passed for morning on the station, Thomas found a small crate outside his door. Inside were several new devices, a flexible resistance band made of some alien material, a pair of weighted orbs that floated just above the ground, and a slim data pad labeled Human Cognitive Engagement. He picked up the data pad and chuckled. It was loaded with old Earth shows, sitcoms, documentaries, even a few ancient cartoons. Someone had clearly taken his offhand comment about TV recovery seriously. Well, Thomas said to himself, at least they're trying. He spent the next few hours alternating between stretching exercises and watching grainy reruns of an ancient sitcom where humans bumbled through everyday life. The laughter track felt oddly comforting even as he winced through each movement of his shoulder. By the time Clint returned to check on him, Thomas was balancing one of the weighted orbs on his good knee while half-heartedly quoting lines from the show on the screen. You appear. Content, Clint observed. Yeah, Thomas said. This is more my speed. Clint set down a new set of instructions. After this cycle, you will transition to partial load-bearing activities. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Meaning? You will lift moderate weights with your injured limb, Clint said. Incremental increases only. Thomas nodded. Sounds reasonable. Clint hesitated. You have demonstrated unexpected compliance. Thomas smiled lazily. You finally figured out humans aren't all chaos and noise? Clint's tendrils twitched. Statistical analysis remains inconclusive. Thomas laughed, a real, light sound. His shoulders still throbbed, his muscles still protested, but the worst was behind him. Over the next few days, the exercises grew steadily more challenging but never beyond what Thomas could handle. Clint adjusted the protocols based on his feedback, and for once, the relentless efficiency of the aliens found a kind of rhythm alongside human stubbornness. By the end of the standard week, Thomas was able to lift his arm above his head without searing pain. Clint signed off on his medical clearance with a ceremonious tap of his tablet. Recovery within acceptable parameters, Clint declared. Thomas flexed his shoulder experimentally. Feels good. You have demonstrated considerable biological resilience, Clint said. Thomas clapped him gently on the back. Told you. We bounce back. As he walked through the station's human sector, Thomas caught glimpses of other aliens watching him with something that looked suspiciously like admiration or maybe just confusion. Either way, he didn't mind. He had survived the fall, the surgery, the zero-G gymnastics, and the endless tests of patience. Somewhere along the line, he had stopped being a medical anomaly and just become another stubborn human doing what humans did best. Adapting, healing, carrying on. And maybe, in the vast, bewildering sprawl of the galaxy, that was enough.